The prelude to war in 1939 was appeasement. The term has its origins in Appeasement, a word popularized in the 1920s by Aristide Briand, French foreign minister. Hopeful agreements of that decade, the Locarno Treaty and Kellogg-Briand Pact, were harbingers of Munich in 1938. Though the man in the street was skeptical about the permanence of such agreements from the outset, it took the Depression, resulting economic dislocation, and that vague complex of unsavory features grouped under the heading of moral decay to create a climate in which appeasement could flourish. By early 1934, French domestic politics had deteriorated to a point where the days of the Third Republic seemed numbered. Revelations following the suicide of Serge Stavisky, a notorious confidence man who had nonetheless managed to escape justice, implicated French officials at the cabinet level. Stavisky's suicide, the climax of his flight from Paris, and the beginning of a major scandal were the stuff that legends are made of. A novel and a highly popular film produced shortly after the affair alluded to the complex inner workings of the case.
Dédale dans ce grouillement, Pépé est chez lui. Et pour l'arrêter, il ne suffit pas de se lever de bonne heure.
Et il est bien gardé, hein? Il a sa bande. Là-haut, toute la pègre est complice. Les nouvelles filent de terrasse en terrasse. Pas besoin de journaux.
Il y a des espions sur tous les toits, et qui se téléphonent à leur manière. Les portes s'ouvrent et se referment, sans qu'on sache pourquoi. Les revolvers partent tout seuls. Le Moko n'a que des amis, où nous n'avons, nous, que des ennemis. Demandez à l'inspecteur Sliman.
Un fils du diable a toujours avec lui tous les fils du démon. Le Moko, un prince de la razzia. 15 condamnations, 33 vols qualifiés, 2 attaques de banque. Et pour les plus petits cambriolages, en nous y mettant tous ici, nous ne pourrions pas les compter sur les doigts de nos mains. C'est forcé que les autres l'admirent. Et bon garçon avec ça, le cœur sur la main, le sourire aussi facile pour ses amis que le coup de couteau pour ses ennemis. Bref, charmant.
When Premier Camille Choton attempted to brush an inquiry aside, demonstrations forced his resignation in late January. Choton's departure created a vacuum at the center of political life that reflected a larger social crisis. As 1934 progressed, the seeming permanence of the Third Republic bored many Frenchmen. The Depression was arriving gradually. Its effects were less severe in France than in the larger and more industrial Germany and the United States, but its consequences were nonetheless beginning to be felt by the early 1930s. Jean Renoir's film Baudu Saved from Drowning was critical of middle-class venality. When it was screened in Parisian theaters, opening night patrons were enraged at Renoir's apparent radicalism and tore up the seats so that the cinema was forced to close its doors.
Rien.
À quoi pensez-vous?
Ah,
Monsieur le Saint-Gouin n'est pas là.
on m'a dit que toi, il changeait encore en d'air.
Vous êtes folle.
Oui.
Bien. Pourquoi reculez-vous? Je vous fais peur?
Oui.
Votre conscience vous fait donc si grave reproche? Méchant.
Je suis pas méchant.
On a donc déjà tout oublié. Dites-donc, on ne vous veut pas de mal. Au contraire. Mais vous n'êtes donc pas heureux ici? Dites. Qu'est-ce que tu as? Réponds, mon chéri. Qu'est-ce que tu as depuis 8 jours? Mon fils bien-aimé.
Vous approchez encore, Rio.
Qu'est-ce que vous faites là? Oh mon Dieu.
Si tu te trouves mal, je te fais une gifle, tu entends?
Oh. Oh, Madame Cambrion.
Alors, toi, c'est toi, hein?
C'est le scandale dans une maison bourgeoise.
Et puis toi, c'est toi aussi.
Il me semble que nous avons plusieurs points.
In their outrage, few understood Renoir's underlying skepticism. Moral improvement was impossible. Baudu remained the utter tramp he always had been, and Renoir's bourgeoisie seemed similarly incorrigible.
Il est parti ou il s'est noyé? Quel sauvage! Il peut bien être où il voudra. Je m'en moque.
C'est sa destinée quand il a repris le fil de l'eau.
More pointed in its criticism of the middle class, indeed of the entire social structure, was the nihilistic zero for conduct, a metaphor for French society in the 1930s. Its director, Jean Vigo, never lived to see his prophetic visions realized in the imminent complete collapse of the interwar social order and resulting anarchy. He died in poverty, aged 29. Politicians in times of crisis are seldom afforded the leisure of reflection. Certainly Édouard Daladier, Chauton's successor, who held power less than 2 weeks, was no exception, though his education and political experience led some to expect more from him than he delivered. Daladier was a classical scholar and former history teacher whose chief claim to fame until 1934 was his brief stint as premier. A colorless politician, Daladier managed only to antagonize all parties, but his departure, at least, had as its backdrop the spectacular, if inconclusive, riots of February 6. Though the left was subsequently to accuse the right of a fascist plot to overthrow the Republic, all factions, from the rightist leagues to the communists, were too disorganized to capitalize on the disorder. Groups of all persuasions broke up in the early hours of February 7 in time to take the last subway home. Ineffectual though the riots were, they owned a significance beyond the 15 killed, the nearly 1,500 wounded, and the heavy property damage. The fascist leagues, the Jeunesse Patriote and Solidarité Française among them, recalling the violence which led to the power of Mussolini and Hitler, had demanded and received their martyrs. February 6, 1934 served as a signal to attract financial support and recruits to the extreme right. The communists, too, had been alerted to the internal threats to the Republic, and thus to the threat to their own existence. They would redouble their efforts over the next 2 years to forge a coalition with the socialists. After the riots, Gaston Doumergue formed a government and emerged as a national father figure, but Doumergue's efforts to revive the Republic through a conservative constitutional reform failed. The Leagues and the radical conservatives continued to consolidate their power and to bide their time. By 1935, Pierre Laval, a moderate conservative and follower of Briand, emerged as the most influential figure in the government. Both as a foreign minister and as premier, he attempted to strengthen France's position. In January, he signed an agreement with Mussolini, bolstering Italy's guarantee of Austrian independence. In April, he attempted, with little long-term success, to strengthen France's system of alliances by meeting with the British and Italian foreign ministers at Stresa on Lake Maggiore. The following month, he concluded a 5-year defensive pact with the Soviet Union. The pact, usually considered to be Laval's most significant achievement, indirectly furthered the efforts of the Socialist and Communist parties to establish a popular front. The two parties had met in July 1934 and agreed on very general objectives. All during 1935, the Communists and Socialists continued their cooperation, ostensibly with a semi-official sanction. In domestic politics, Laval attacked the problems of the Depression, but his deflationary policies, forced through by decree, undermined his political strength. In the election of January 1936, the Popular Front coalition of socialists, liberals, and communists came out the winner. Foreign policy had been considered Laval's strong point. Ironically, it was a foreign policy crisis that accompanied his fall. As all the important radicals withdrew from Laval's cabinet, public indignation rose over a plan to partition Ethiopia, which had been invaded by Mussolini in October 1935. This was the Hoare-Laval proposal, details of which had been leaked to the press. Both Laval and the British Foreign Secretary Sir Samuel Hoare were discredited by the episode, though neither permanently. Laval had wanted to conciliate Mussolini and preserve Stresa. His proposal had no immediate effect on long-range fascist diplomacy. Ethiopia was defeated after the Italians used mustard gas on Emperor Haile Selassie's defenseless tribesmen. He fled the country in May 1936. In June, he spoke before the League of Nations.
እኔ ቀዳማዊ ኃይለ ሥላሴ የኢትዮጵያ ንጉሠ ነገሥት የዛሬ 8 ወር 50 መንግስታት
Haile Selassie's words, a fitting epitaph for the first international body of states, were ignored by the League. In mid-July, half-hearted economic League sanctions against Italy were completely lifted. Mussolini responded with contempt for the League and his former partners, Britain and France. Their reluctance to impose sanctions had been prompted by the desire to maintain the Stresa front. Instead, Mussolini turned away from the two Western powers and toward Germany. Gradually, he became convinced that the Italian and German political systems were the wave of the future. On March 7, 1936, Hitler had remilitarized the Rhineland without opposition from Britain and France. From the summer of 1936, Italy began to be drawn more and more into the German orbit. The impetus was provided by the Spanish Civil War, which broke out in mid-July. Both Italy and Germany sent troops to the assistance of General Franco in his attempt to destroy the Spanish Popular Front government.
Three Junker planes did this.
In France, Popular Front supporters saw the conflict in Spain as a threat to democracy. They correctly perceived the fascists as the most dangerous adversaries of Western civilization and its best traditions. Hitherto ignored by leftists as apolitical or even as conservative, Jean Renoir emerged as the most important cinematic spokesman of the Popular Front. His film, The Crime of Monsieur Lange, became their credo and a measure of French opinion in 1936. In the story, Lange, who symbolizes the democratic collectivist, confronts the corrupt and callous fascist Battala.
Les coopératives. Mais qu'est-ce que c'est que ça, les coopératives? C'est dérisoire, mon vieux, c'est de la foutaise. C'est la pagaille, je te jure. Tout le monde dirige. Le colleur d'affiche donne son avis. Oh, mais non, ce qu'il faut, c'est une autorité, c'est quelqu'un qui dirige, un homme, moi. Et puis si ça me plaît, je foutrais tout le monde à la porte. Vous n'avez fait que des saloperies ici. Il y a que depuis que vous êtes parti que ça marche. Vous voulez revenir pour te foutre par terre? C'est bien dommage que je sois pas mort, hein. Devrait me tuer. Ah oui.
Though Lange manages to destroy his enemy and escape to another country, thereby symbolizing the imaginary victory of the anti-fascists, there were to be few actual victories for the Popular Front, particularly in the area of foreign policy. France's first socialist premier and leader of the Popular Front, Léon Blum, was Jewish, an intellectual, and a pacifist who wished for reasonable and non-violent solutions. He failed to reckon with the rising totalitarian temper of the late 1930s. A product of late 19th century humanitarian idealism, he had first entered politics as a Dreyfusard, a supporter of Alfred Dreyfus in the 1890s, Blum sought to strengthen France's alliance with Britain as a logical counterweight to the fascist and Soviet dictatorships. As in Ethiopia, both France and Britain proved ineffectual in forestalling fascist victory in the Spanish Civil War. Though Spain had had a Popular Front government since early 1936, France refused aid to its neighbor, fearing to offend Mussolini. The British government had no liking for the Spanish government, and most British specialists in Spanish affairs inclined toward Franco. Even the slight private assistance to Spain from Britain and France was disowned by their governments. Blum was only able to overcome his party members' call for France's intervention in Spain by holding out the specter of general war. Meanwhile, in Britain, rearmament was well underway. It has been said that Neville Chamberlain, more than any man, laid the foundations for British fighting power during the Second World War. 2 years before he became Prime Minister in May 1937, rearmament had begun. It proceeded by fits and starts, largely through Chamberlain's prodding. In Britain, as in France, there was widespread anxiety about the casualties another general war would produce. H.G. Wells was typical.
Nice toys they have nowadays. Nice toys. The toys we had were simpler, ever so much simpler. Noah's Arks and wooden soldiers. Nothing complex like these. You know, I wonder sometimes if perhaps all these new toys aren't a bit too much for them.
It teaches them to use their hands.
And I suppose their grandchildren will see even more wonderful things. Progress, progress. I'd like to see the wonders they'll see.
Won't be too sure of progress.
Oh, listen to the incurable pessimist.
What's to stop progress nowadays? War.
First, there isn't going to be a war, and secondly, war doesn't stop progress. It stimulates progress.
Yes, war can be a highly stimulating thing, but you can overdo a stimulant.
Oh, well, after all, I'll be exaggerating the horrors of war. Don't we rather overdo that song?
More perceptively, others realized the futility of appeasement, as the 1937 film version of James Hilton's Lost Horizon suggests.
Oh, Freshy. Did you make that report out yet?
Yes, Bob.
Did you say we saved 90 white people?
Yes.
Good. Hooray for us. Did you say that we left 10,000 natives down there to be annihilated? No. No, you wouldn't say that. They don't count.
You'd better try to get some sleep, Bob.
Just you wait till I'm Foreign Secretary. Can't you just see me, Freshy, with all those other shrewd little Foreign Secretaries? You see, the trick is to see who can out-talk the other. Everybody wants something for nothing. And if you can't get it with smooth talk, you send your army in. But I'm going to fool them, Freshy. I'm not going to have an army. I'm going to disband mine. I'm going to sink my battleships. I'm going to destroy every piece of warcraft. Then when the enemy approaches, we'll say, "Come in, gentlemen, what can we do for you?" So then the poor enemy soldiers will stop and think. And what will they think, Freshy? They'll say to themselves, "There's something wrong here. We've been duped. This is not according to form. These people seem quite friendly, and why should we shoot them?" Then they'll lay down their arms. See how simple the whole thing is? Centuries of tradition kicked right in the pants. And now I'll be slapped straight into the nearest insane asylum.
You'd better not drink anymore, Bob. You're not talking sense.
Don't worry, George. Nothing's going to happen. I'll fall right into line. I'll be the good little boy that everybody wants me to be. I'll be the best little foreign secretary we've ever had. Just because I haven't the nerve to be anything else.
In any event, little was done by the stronger European powers when Hitler took over Austria in March 1938. French Foreign Minister Joseph Paul Boncourt regretted the general lassitude and inaction of his own country and Britain, and inquired what the USSR would do if Czechoslovakia were threatened. This angered London, but since Blum's second cabinet was overthrown the following month, few in Britain thought to take action. Most Austrians were overjoyed by the Anschluss. In a popular film, Wiener Geschichten of 1940, the Viennese celebrated the joining of two inns of contrasting size and prosperity, the marriage of Mr. Germany to Miss Austria. Austria.
Ja, was soll denn das bedeuten, ha?
Kommen.
Was ist denn?
Einen Moment.
Was das
Bitte
bedeuten
schön.
soll, will ich wissen.
Eine Vereinigung der lieben Frau Christine Lechner mit dem guten Herrn Ferdinand Reitmeier, und zwar auf Lebenszeit.
Shortly before its overthrow, Blum's cabinet had filed an ineffectual protest against Germany's occupation of Austria and done nothing more. This was scarcely surprising because the record of the Popular Front towards Nazi and Italian aggression since 1936 had been weak, but worse was to come in April 1938. Daladier named Georges Bonnet foreign minister in his new government. Bonnet was weak and turned out to be one of the chief appeasers during the Czech crisis in the summer. Initially, Daladier was less inclined to capitulate to Germany than either Bonnet or Chamberlain, after it seemed apparent that, after Austria, that Czechoslovakia was Hitler's next intended victim. Daladier told Chamberlain at the end of April that France was willing to fight if necessary to prevent the absorption of Czechoslovakia into the Third Reich. But Chamberlain bullied Daladier into accepting his appeasement line in order to conciliate 3.5 million Sudeten Germans living on the western fringes of Czechoslovakia. The German enclave was a legacy of the Versailles Treaty. Both the founder of the Czech state and its later president, Tomáš Masaryk and Eduard Beneš, respectively, had argued that Czechoslovakia needed Bohemia and Moravia, a mountainous area, to form a neutral boundary. But Hitler was of another mind. Czechoslovakia was to be deprived of its German territories, which he would then add to the new Reich. This done, the remainder of the hated state could be destroyed, he thought, by war, if necessary. In fact, Hitler wanted a war over Czechoslovakia and was disappointed when the Sudeten crisis was settled by negotiation. But Chamberlain believed that all Hitler wanted was the Sudetenland. If he got this, Chamberlain's much sought-after Anglo-German understanding could be reached and another general war averted. Here Chamberlain, twice Chancellor of the Exchequer, realized only too well how much Britain had been weakened by the Great War and the Depression. He also reflected in his wider attitudes toward Germany, a complex of war hatred, defeatism, and feelings among significant numbers of the British, that Germany had been wronged at the 1919 peace conference. Territorial adjustments were in order, and the Sudeten Germans were a matter of indifference to London. All during the spring and summer of 1938, the situation in Central Europe deteriorated. In May, the Czechs had mobilized in response to what seemed an imminent German invasion. As early as March, the Soviet Union, referring to Czechoslovakia, had expressed willingness to consult with other interested states for the purpose of checking the further development of aggression and of eliminating the increased danger of a world massacre. Chamberlain discouraged such consultation and placated Hitler. This only encouraged Nazi radicalism. On June 3, Propaganda Minister Goebbels, echoing Hitler, exclaimed that Czechoslovakia, this filthy state, Dreckstaat, must disappear. Despite some doubts about Nazi trustworthiness following the May crisis, Chamberlain persisted in his illusions that Hitler would behave like a gentleman and collaborate in a lasting peace if the Sudeten crisis could be resolved. For his part, Hitler intuited that Britain would negotiate. Clashes between Czechs and Sudeten Germans increased the tension during the summer. Chamberlain presented an appearance of unconcern. He went fishing, but a further sharpening of the crisis prompted his return to London. By the end of August, he had decided to fly to Germany to meet Hitler in an attempt to avert war. The fate of the Sudetenland was insignificant to him. He wrote to Hitler on September 13 asking for a meeting. Hitler replied the following day, stating that he was at Chamberlain's disposal. On September 15, Chamberlain made the first of 3 flights to Germany. Instantly, he became enormously popular in Britain. At the time of his first flight, Chamberlain's cabinet seemed to believe that the Prime Minister would attempt to negotiate a plebiscite. The inhabitants of the disputed territories could decide which country they would belong to. However, during the first meeting at Berchtesgaden, Hitler introduced the issue of outright cession of the Sudetenland. Chamberlain was prepared to endorse his demand, but he first had to persuade the French and then his cabinet. Upon his return to London, Bonnet and Daladier were summoned to number 10 Downing Street. Daladier saw immediately that self-determination would lead the other nationalities within the Czech state to assert their own demands. The destruction of Czechoslovakia would follow, Daladier thought, and Hitler's appetite for more territory would increase. Chamberlain thereupon suggested that the Sudetenland be ceded outright. Daladier accepted this as the best solution to the crisis. To have done otherwise might have forced France to invoke her alliance with Czechoslovakia and involve her in a war with Germany. Chamberlain then persuaded his cabinet that the territorial cession had been France's idea, when in fact it had been Hitler's. The cabinet endorsed the plan, and the Czechs were presented with an Anglo-French ultimatum: yield the disputed territories to Germany in return for a joint guarantee against unprovoked aggression for the remainder of the Czech state, or face Germany alone. Ultimately, the Czechs accepted the Anglo-French terms. With the endorsement in his pocket, Chamberlain returned to Germany, this time to Bad Godesberg. But Hitler was unwilling to accept the terms he had first specified at Berchtesgaden. Other nationalities within Czechoslovakia had demands to make, he said, and had the endorsement of Germany. Furthermore, the Czechs must withdraw from the Sudetenland at once, and the territory be ceded immediately to Germany without compensation to the Czechs, or Germany would attack. Deeply dispirited by Hitler's new terms, Chamberlain returned to London without reaching agreement with Hitler. In the Prime Minister's absence, opposition had begun to form. Churchill and Eden had made speeches against the government. Clearly, the crisis must soon be resolved if Czechoslovakia were not to be invaded and a general war precipitated. Chamberlain made one last appeal to Hitler for further negotiation through Sir Horace Wilson, a high-ranking civil servant. Hitler at first equivocated, but at last agreed to meet with Chamberlain once more. On September 29, Chamberlain flew to Germany for the third and final time. He and Hitler met at Munich. They were joined by Daladier and Mussolini. The latter had obtained from Hitler a postponement of a threatened mobilization. At 2 a.m. on September 30, all parties signed an agreement proposed by Mussolini but actually drafted by the Germans. The Sudetenland was to be occupied the following day, the occupation to be completed by October 10. The final boundaries of Czechoslovakia were to be determined by an international commission consisting of the four countries, as well as a Czech representative. Britain and France guaranteed the remainder of Czechoslovakia against an unprovoked attack. Once Hungarian and Polish claims to portions of Czechoslovakia had been settled, Italy and Germany would join the guarantee. Later that morning, Chamberlain stopped by Hitler's flat. After touching on a number of issues that had earlier divided Britain and Germany, the Prime Minister produced a document of his own drafting indicating the desire of the two countries to consult on matters of mutual concern. The Munich Agreement, Chamberlain continued, and the earlier Anglo-German naval agreement symbolized the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again. Hitler seemed conciliatory during the meeting, agreeing on the points Chamberlain had raised, and readily signed the document. The meeting then ended, and Chamberlain returned to London the same day. Chamberlain believed he had received Hitler's endorsement for lasting peace. Hitler knew otherwise. Waving the final document with his and Hitler's signatures, Chamberlain proclaimed to cheering crowds that it meant peace for our time. The British ambassador to Germany, Nevile Henderson, perceptively observed that the strain, both mental and material, under which the German people had been working since 1933 was immense and required an increasingly violent psychological stimulus to keep working. In spite of the fact that Hitler had no intention of keeping his promise at Munich to end Germany's territorial expansion, he could not have halted even if he had wished to. His very success compelled him to further adventures. When, following the Munich agreement, the British ambassador remarked to von Ribbentrop, Hitler's foreign minister, that a Bismarck would have taken 10 years to consolidate his position, Ribbentrop replied that the Englishman did not understand the dynamics of National Socialist diplomacy. Many in Britain and France were fooled into believing that lasting peace had been achieved. Jean Renoir was not. His 1939 film, Rules of the Game, begun in the immediate aftermath of Munich and completed less than 2 months before the outbreak of war, reveals a society in disintegration. The dance of death scene, performed by the wealthy bourgeois guests at the chateau of their host, the Marquis de la Chesnaye, was perhaps just that death that haunted Europe between Munich and the war. In the Soviet Union, filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein saw Munich for the craven surrender to Nazi expansionism that it was. Until they were confronted with might greater than their own, the Nazis would continue to trample upon civilization. In Eisenstein's film Alexander Nevsky, the citizens of 13th century Pskov are exterminated by the conquering Teutonic Knights, the ancestors of the Nazis. In March 1939, Hitler occupied Prague, and the rest of Czechoslovakia was dismembered. Chamberlain's critics in the House of Commons were outraged. Goebbels mocked him as that good old man. Remarkably, Chamberlain would linger on as Prime Minister for another 8 months following the outbreak of war in September. Such was his power and the lingering appeal of appeasement. Chamberlain had few distinguishing personal characteristics apart from the umbrella he habitually carried. Following the occupation of Prague, he was derided as the umbrella man, but the storm threatened all of Europe. In 1940, an Alfred Hitchcock film, Foreign Correspondent, featured a remarkable sequence in which the assassination of an elderly and distinguished statesman was ignored by a crowd of umbrella-bearing spectators, a scene whose symbolism no one could fail to miss. The policy of appeasement, which Chamberlain had believed would provide the basis for the restructuring of Europe, was finally and totally discredited.